What happens when a man chosen by God begins to believe he no longer needs him? That question isn't just ancient history, it's the fault line where greatness quietly fractures into corruption, where a hero slowly becomes the very thing he once fought against. Before the confrontation, before the parable, before the 4 words that would shatter a king, there was a transformation so subtle, so human, that almost no one saw it happening. This is where the story truly begins, not with a prophet, but with a king who stopped being questioned. At the height of his power, David was no longer the shepherd boy who faced giants with nothing but a sling and faith. He was a ruler surrounded by walls, servants, victories, and silence. And silence, more than anything, is what changes a man. Because when no one challenges you, when every voice around you echoes approval, reality begins to bend. The danger isn't sudden corruption, it's gradual insulation. It's the slow disappearance of friction, the quiet removal of consequences, the intoxicating illusion that you are always right because no one dares to say you're wrong. And in that silence, something dangerous began to grow inside David. Not just confidence, but invulnerability. But here's the unsettling truth. David didn't wake up one day and decide to become corrupt. That's not how power works. Power whispers before it shouts. It suggests before it commands. It convinces you that exceptions are justified, that rules are flexible, that your past righteousness somehow earns you present immunity. And for David, that whisper began on a rooftop, in a moment that seemed small enough to ignore, but powerful enough to change everything. Because the greatest falls don't begin with grand decisions, they begin with quiet permissions. Imagine the scene. A king who should have been at war chooses instead to stay behind. That alone tells you something has shifted. Leaders who once ran toward responsibility now drift from it. And that drift creates space for temptation, space for rationalization, space for choices that would have once been unthinkable. And in that space, David sees something he wants. Not something he needs, not something he's entitled to, just something he decides he can take. And in that moment, the line between desire and action dissolves. Here's the hook you can't ignore. The most dangerous moment in any leader's life is not when they are weak, it's when they are strong enough to get away with being wrong. Because strength without accountability doesn't produce greatness, it produces distortion. David didn't just take what wasn't his. He believed he could redefine what was his. And once that belief takes root, every decision that follows becomes easier to justify, easier to repeat, easier to escalate. Because one act never stands alone. It demands protection. It demands secrecy. It demands a system of lies strong enough to hold it together. And that's where the transformation becomes irreversible, not when the first sin is committed, but when the second one is required to hide it. David could have stopped. He could have confessed. He could have stepped back into the humility that once defined him. But power doesn't like reversal. Power prefers momentum. And momentum, once corrupted, accelerates toward destruction. So what does a king do when his secret is at risk of exposure? He doesn't panic, he strategizes. And that's what makes this moment so chilling. This isn't emotional chaos, it's calculated control. David begins to orchestrate outcomes, manipulating people like pieces on a board, not out of desperation, but out of confidence that he can manage the consequences. And that confidence is the most dangerous thing of all because it replaces morality with logistics. Uriah becomes more than a man, he becomes a problem to solve. And when a human being becomes a problem instead of a person, the moral barrier has already collapsed. This is where the story stops being about temptation and becomes about power. Because David doesn't just make a mistake, he builds a system to protect it. He calls Uriah back, not to honor him, but to use him. He creates scenarios, sets traps, manipulates perception, all to maintain a version of reality that isn't true. And when those strategies fail, when the plan doesn't unfold as expected, he escalates. Here's another hook that cuts deeper than the first. Corruption reveals itself, not in the initial wrongdoing, but in how far someone is willing to go to avoid being exposed. And David goes all the way, not impulsively, not accidentally, but deliberately. He writes the order, he seals it, he ensures it reaches the battlefield. And in a twist almost too dark to comprehend, Uriah carries the very command that will lead to his own death. That's not just injustice, that's calculated annihilation. And still, the kingdom remains silent. That silence is not passive, it's participatory. Because systems of power don't collapse in isolation, they are upheld by those who choose comfort over truth. Advisors who say nothing, soldiers who obey without question, messengers who deliver orders without reflection. Every layer of the system becomes complicit, not because they are evil, but because they are afraid, or worse, because they are accustomed to obedience. And that's what makes unchecked power so resilient. It doesn't just corrupt the leader, it conditions everyone around him. Now pause and consider this. How does a man who once wrote songs of repentance become a man who orchestrates death without hesitation? The answer isn't that he changed overnight, it's that he adapted to a world where his actions no longer had immediate consequences. And when consequences disappear, conscience weakens, not instantly, but gradually. Like a muscle that's no longer used, it begins to fade, to soften, to lose its strength. But here's the tension that sets the stage for everything that follows. David still believes in justice. He still sees himself as a righteous king. That's the paradox. Because the most dangerous kind of corruption is not the kind that abandons morality, it's the kind that redefines it. David doesn't think he's become unjust. He thinks he's operating within a reality that justifies his actions. And that internal narrative is what makes him unreachable, at least by conventional means. Because you can't confront someone who doesn't believe they're wrong. And that's exactly why no one steps forward. Not the generals, not the advisors, not the servants. The throne room becomes a place of agreement, not truth. A place where loyalty is measured by silence, not honesty. And in that environment, the king's version of reality becomes the only version that exists. Until someone is willing to break it. But that moment hasn't come yet. For now, David sits securely on his throne, his secret buried beneath layers of strategy and success. The kingdom continues. The victories remain. The image is intact. From the outside, nothing has changed. And that's what makes this part of the story so unsettling, because the collapse hasn't happened yet, but the foundation is already cracked. The danger isn't visible. but it's inevitable. Here's your next hook. The most catastrophic failures in history don't begin when things fall apart. They begin when everything still looks fine. Because that's when no one is looking for the problem. That's when no one is prepared for the truth. That's when the intervention, if it comes at all, must be precise, strategic, and fearless. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, there is a man who sees what no one else is willing to say. A man who understands that confronting power requires more than courage, it requires wisdom. Because if you approach a king the wrong way, you don't just fail, you die. This isn't a conversation. This is a calculated risk. A moment where truth must be delivered in a way that bypasses defenses, dismantles illusions, and forces recognition. But before that confrontation happens, you need to understand one final piece of the puzzle. David is not a villain in his own story. He is still the hero, at least in his mind. And that's what makes him so dangerous. Because heroes don't expect to be exposed. They expect to be affirmed. And that expectation is about to be shattered. Not with an accusation, not with an army, but with a story. Because sometimes, the only way to reach a man who has everything is to show him something he cannot escape. What do you say to a man who cannot be corrected? Not because he lacks intelligence, but because he has lost the ability to see himself clearly. Not because he rejects truth, but because he no longer recognizes it when it threatens him. This is the problem Nathan faced a king so powerful that direct confrontation would not just fail, it would backfire. Because when power feels attacked, it doesn't reflect, it retaliates. And Nathan knew something that most people never understand. Truth, when delivered the wrong way, becomes invisible. So he doesn't begin with an accusation. He begins with a story. Now pause here, because this is where everything changes. This is not improvisation. This is strategy at the highest level. Nathan isn't just brave, he's precise. He understands the psychology of a man who has insulated himself from accountability. He knows that if he walks into the throne room and says, "You have sinned," David's defenses will rise instantly. The king will justify, deflect, rationalize. Power will protect itself. The conversation will end before it even begins. So Nathan chooses a different weapon, one that doesn't look like a weapon at all. A narrative. Here's the hook. Sometimes the only way to expose the truth is to hide it inside a story the listener thinks is about someone else. Because when a man believes he is judging another, he unknowingly reveals himself. And Nathan is about to turn David's greatest strength, his sense of justice, into the very trap that will dismantle him. Imagine Nathan walking into the throne room. This isn't just a visit, it's a calculated risk. Every step he takes carries weight. Every word he is about to speak could determine whether he walks out alive. Because kings are not corrected, they are obeyed. And yet here stands a prophet, preparing to do what no advisor, no general, no servant has dared to do. Confront the most powerful man in the nation without triggering his defenses. He begins simply. There were two men in a city. No accusation. No tension, at least not on the surface. Just a story. But underneath that simplicity lies a precision so sharp it borders on surgical. Nathan is constructing a mirror, but not one David can recognize yet. Because if David sees himself too early, the illusion breaks, the defenses rise, the opportunity is lost. So the story unfolds slowly, deliberately. One man is rich, the other is poor. The rich man has everything: flocks, herds, abundance beyond need. The poor man has almost nothing, just one small ewe lamb. But this lamb is not just property. It's personal. It eats from his table. It drinks from his cup. It lies in his arms. It is family. And as this story develops, something begins to happen, not in the room, but in David's mind. Because this is familiar territory. This is where he thrives. Justice, fairness, right and wrong. The king who once protected the weak is now being invited back into that identity. Not as the accused, but as the judge. And that's the brilliance of Nathan's approach. Because David is no longer defending himself, he is evaluating someone else. Here's another hook. The most effective confrontations don't attack a person's identity, they align with it, then reveal the contradiction. Nathan doesn't challenge David's sense of justice, he activates it. He draws him in. He makes him care. He makes him feel. And then he introduces the turning point. A traveler arrives. The rich man, despite having everything, refuses to take from his own abundance. Instead, he takes the one thing the poor man has. The lamb, and slaughters it to serve his guest. Now the trap is set. Because this is no longer just a story, it's an injustice so clear, so visceral, that it demands a response. And David responds exactly as Nathan knew he would. With anger, with conviction, with judgment. As surely as the Lord lives, David declares, the man who did this deserves to die. There it is. The verdict. Not whispered, not uncertain, absolute. Immediate, uncompromising. And in that moment, something extraordinary has happened. David has condemned himself without realizing it. He has pronounced judgment on a reflection of his own actions, believing it belonged to someone else. The king who thought his secret was buried has just exposed the standard by which he himself must now be measured. Now pause again, because this is the pivot point of the entire narrative. Everything up to this moment has been preparation. Everything after this moment will be revelation. And the space between those two is where Nathan speaks the most dangerous words of his life. You are the man. No explanation. No build-up. No escape. Just 4 words. And with those 4 words, the illusion collapses. This is the hook that changes everything. The most powerful defenses a person builds can be destroyed in a single moment of undeniable clarity. Because when truth is no longer external, when it becomes personal, it cannot be ignored. It cannot be debated. It cannot be redirected. It lands with a force that bypasses logic and strikes directly at identity. David is no longer the judge. He is the subject. The story is no longer about someone else. It is about him. And in that instant, the entire structure he built, every justification, every rationalization, every layer of denial begins to crumble. Not because Nathan overpowered him, but because Nathan outmaneuvered him. He didn't confront David's authority, he confronted his self-perception. And that's why this moment works. Because Nathan never argued. He revealed. He didn't accuse David of injustice, he allowed David to define justice, then showed him where he stood in relation to it. And that's a level of confrontation most people never reach, because it requires patience, insight, and the willingness to risk everything on a single, perfectly timed moment. Now imagine the silence that follows. Not the comfortable silence of agreement, but the heavy, suffocating silence of realization. The kind that fills a room when something irreversible has just happened. Because there is no undoing this, no reinterpreting it, no escaping it. David sees it, not partially, not defensively, completely. And that's what makes this moment so devastating. Because for the first time since the rooftop, the king is no longer in control of the narrative. The truth has stepped in, uninvited and undeniable. And it has done what no army, no rebellion, no external threat could ever do. It has broken through the walls he built around himself. But here's the deeper layer, the one most people miss. Nathan didn't just confront David. He restored him to himself. Because buried beneath the corruption, beneath the power, beneath the silence, there was still a man who cared about justice. A man who knew right from wrong. A man who could feel the weight of his own actions if only he could see them clearly. And Nathan gave him that clarity, at great personal risk. Because let's not forget what's at stake here. This isn't a conversation between equals. This is a prophet standing before a king who has already proven he is capable of orchestrating death to protect his secrets. Nathan is not protected by position. He is not shielded by power. His only defense is the truth itself, and the truth, in this moment, is enough. But that doesn't mean the danger is over, because exposure is only the beginning. Recognition is not yet repentance, and realization, as powerful as it is, does not erase consequences. Here's your final hook for this part. The moment a person sees the truth about themselves is not the end of the story, it's the beginning of a far more difficult one. Because now comes the question that determines everything. What will David do with what he now knows? Will he harden? Will he deflect? Will he punish the messenger and reassert control? Or will he do the one thing power resists more than anything else: submit? Because the next moment will reveal whether this confrontation was just a brilliant strategy, or the turning point of a king's soul. What does it actually cost when a leader fails, not in theory, not in words, but in reality that unfolds over time? Because the moment of confession feels decisive, almost clean. Like a line has been drawn and the story can now move forward. But that's an illusion. Confession may end denial, but it does not end consequence. And for King David, the real story doesn't begin at "I have sinned." It begins with everything that comes after. Because actions don't disappear once they're acknowledged. They echo. And those echoes are about to move through his life, his family, and his kingdom in ways he cannot control. Here's the first hook. The most devastating consequences are not the ones that strike immediately, they are the ones that unfold slowly, forcing you to live inside the reality you created. Because David is not struck down. He is not removed from power. He is allowed to continue, and that continuation is where the weight truly settles. Because now, every day becomes a reminder. Every decision becomes heavier. Every silence becomes louder. And the first fracture is deeply personal. The child born from David's actions becomes the center of a quiet, agonizing tension. This is no longer political, no longer abstract, it is intimate. A life that should represent joy instead becomes a symbol of consequence. And when that life begins to fade, David is no longer acting as a king, he is pleading as a father. He fasts, he prays, he lies on the ground. The man who once commanded armies now wrestles with something he cannot command, cannot negotiate, cannot reverse. And here's the hook that cuts through everything. Power can control people, but it cannot control outcomes, because no matter how absolute authority may seem, there are consequences it cannot override. And David is forced to confront that reality in the most painful way possible, not as a ruler, but as a human being. When the child dies, something shifts again, not outwardly at first, but internally, because grief, when mixed with guilt, becomes something heavier than either one alone. It is no longer just loss, it is responsibility. Not in a theoretical sense, but in a deeply personal, unavoidable way. And this is where the story refuses to simplify itself. Because David does something unexpected, he rises, he washes, he worships. To those around him, it doesn't make sense. How can a man mourn so deeply before the loss, and then stand so steadily after it? But that reaction reveals something important. David is not denying the consequence. He is accepting it. Not because it is easy, not because it is fair, but because it is real. And that acceptance marks a shift from resistance to endurance. He is no longer trying to undo what has happened, he is learning to live with it. But the consequences do not stop there. Because sin, especially at the level of leadership, does not remain contained within a single moment or a single relationship. It spreads, it influences, it creates patterns. And what begins as a private failure begins to manifest as a public unraveling. Here's the next hook. When a leader's integrity breaks, it doesn't just affect their decisions, it reshapes the culture around them. Because people follow what is modeled, not what is proclaimed. And the fracture within David's character begins to echo within his household. Tension rises among his sons. Boundaries weaken. Justice becomes inconsistent. And the stability that once defined his reign begins to erode from within. This is not coincidence, it is consequence. Because leadership is not just authority, it is influence. And when that influence is compromised, the effects multiply. Decisions become reactive instead of grounded. Relationships become strained instead of secure. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the kingdom begins to feel the weight of what started as a hidden act. And then it becomes visible. Conflict emerges within David's own family, escalating beyond control. Betrayal replaces trust. Division replaces unity. And what was once hidden in secrecy begins to unfold in full view of the nation. The private sin that David thought he could contain is now shaping public reality in ways he cannot stop. Here's the deeper hook. The consequences of hidden actions often become public not by exposure, but by replication. Because what is allowed internally eventually manifests externally. And David is now watching his own household mirror the instability he once tried to conceal. This is the cost of moral failure at the highest level. Not just personal pain, but systemic disruption. Not just internal guilt, but external chaos. And yet, even in this unraveling, Something important remains. David does not return to denial. He does not pretend everything is fine. He does not rebuild the illusion. Instead, he continues forward, carrying the weight rather than escaping it. That doesn't make the consequences disappear, but it changes how he walks through them. Here's another hook. True accountability is not proven in a moment of confession. It is proven in a lifetime of consistency after the confession. Because anyone can admit wrong under pressure, but living differently, enduring consequences without reverting to old patterns, that is where transformation is tested. And David is now living inside that test. Every fractured relationship, every moment of instability, every reminder of what could have been avoided, all of it becomes part of his reality. And still, he remains, not unchanged, but not destroyed. Because there is a difference. Failure did not remove him from his position, but it redefined how he would carry it. The confidence he once had is now tempered with awareness. The authority he once exercised freely is now shaped by experience. And while the kingdom around him feels the strain, there is also a deeper, quieter shift happening within him, one that cannot be seen from the outside as easily as the consequences can. Humility is taking root, not as an idea, but as a necessity. Because once you have seen the full impact of your actions, you can no longer operate with the same level of carelessness. The illusion of invulnerability is gone, and in its place is something far more grounded: a recognition of limits, of responsibility, of the real cost of every decision. But let's not romanticize this. This is not a story where everything balances out neatly. The damage is real. The losses are permanent. The ripple effects do not simply fade with time. And that's exactly why this part of the story matters. Here's the final hook. Forgiveness may restore the soul, but consequences reshape the life. And those two realities must coexist, no matter how uncomfortable that tension feels. Because without consequence, forgiveness becomes cheap. And without forgiveness, consequence becomes unbearable. David lives in that tension every day. A king who has been restored but not reset. A leader who continues but not without cost. And that is what makes this story timeless. Because it refuses to offer easy answers. It forces us to confront a reality most people try to avoid: that our actions, especially when we hold influence, extend far beyond ourselves. They shape families. They shape systems. They shape futures. And once released, they cannot be called back. But the story is not finished yet. Because from the weight of failure, something else begins to emerge, not immediately, not obviously, but steadily. A legacy not just of power, but of truth. Not just of authority, but of accountability. And at the center of that shift stands one man who made it possible. Not a king, but a prophet. Because without that confrontation, none of this transformation would have begun. What remains after a king has been exposed, a lie has been shattered, and power has been forced to face something it cannot control? Because the confrontation itself is not the end of the story, it is the beginning of a legacy. What Nathan the prophet did in that throne room did more than correct King David. It redefined the relationship between truth and power in a way that would echo far beyond that moment. This was not just about one man's sin. It was about establishing a principle that power is never above accountability. No matter how high it rises, Here's the first hook. The rarest force in any system is not authority, it is truth. That refuses to bend. Because power can silence opposition. It can outmaneuver threats. It can survive rebellion, but it struggles against something far more dangerous. A voice that cannot be bought, cannot be intimidated, and cannot be controlled. Nathan became that voice, not because he held a higher position, but because he carried a higher standard. And when that standard entered the room, the throne itself had to answer to it. This is where the legacy begins, not in the confrontation, but in what it proved possible. Before Nathan, a king's word felt final. Authority moved in one direction, and accountability was limited by power. But in that moment, something shifted permanently. A man without an army, without political leverage, without institutional control, stood before a king and forced him to confront truth. That idea that power can be challenged by truth alone became a pattern that would repeat across history in different forms, in different voices, in different systems. Here's the next hook. Systems are not transformed when power changes hands, they are transformed. When power is forced to answer to something greater than itself. Nathan did not overthrow David. He did something far more disruptive. He placed him under judgment. And once that standard exists, it cannot be contained. It moves quietly, shaping expectations, redefining leadership, creating a new measure for what authority must live up to. And you can see that pattern repeat again and again. Not always through prophets, not always through religion, but through individuals who step into uncomfortable spaces and speak what others avoid. Advisors who refuse to flatter, voices that break through echo chambers. People willing to risk position, reputation, or safety to say what must be said. Different contexts, same function. The role Nathan embodied never disappears, because the need for it never disappears. Now bring this into the present, because this is where the story becomes personal. Modern power doesn't always wear a crown, but it still creates the same conditions: insulation, influence, and the slow erosion of honest feedback. Leaders today are surrounded by systems that reward agreement and filter out resistance. Over time, those systems begin to distort reality, not intentionally at first, but gradually. And in that distortion, the same danger David faced begins to rise again: the belief that perception equals truth. Here's the hook that matters now. The absence of honest voices doesn't protect a leader, it isolates them. Because without friction, there is no correction. Without correction, there is no clarity. And without clarity, even the strongest leader begins to drift into decisions that feel justified in the moment but become destructive over time. That is why Nathan's role is not optional, it is essential. But this is where the tension deepens. Because it's easy to recognize the need for truth, it's much harder to accept it when it arrives. Everyone says they value honesty. Until honesty challenges them directly, everyone claims they want accountability. Until accountability exposes something they would rather keep hidden. And that is exactly why Nathan's approach mattered as much as his courage. Here's the next hook. Truth alone is not enough, it must be delivered in a way that can be received. Nathan did not confront David recklessly. He did not speak out of anger or impulse. He understood timing, psychology, and human nature. He chose a method that bypassed defense instead of triggering it. And because of That his words didn't just reach David, they changed him. That becomes the standard. Not just to speak truth, but to speak it wisely. Not just to confront, but to restore. Because the goal was never destruction. Nathan did not step forward to ruin David, he stepped forward to bring him back from a path that would have destroyed him completely. And that intention shaped everything. The courage was real, but it was not reckless. The message was sharp, but it was not careless. It was truth aimed at restoration, not humiliation. Now the question shifts, and this is where the story turns toward you. Because it's easy to admire Nathan from a distance. It's easy to recognize the importance of what he did. But the real question is not whether his role matters. The real question is whether that role exists in your life. Who has the permission to challenge you when you are wrong? Who is willing to risk your reaction to tell you the truth? Because without that voice, every person, no matter how self-aware they believe they are, is vulnerable to the same drift. Here's the deeper hook. The more influence you have, the more dangerous silence becomes. Because influence amplifies everything. It amplifies your decisions, your blind spots, your impact on others. And without accountability, those blind spots don't stay small, they expand. They shape outcomes. They affect people. And eventually, they create consequences that could have been avoided if someone had spoken sooner. But the story doesn't stop at receiving truth, it also demands that you consider delivering it. Because there will be moments, just like Nathan's, where silence feels safer, easier, more convenient. Moments where speaking up carries risk. And in those moments, the question becomes unavoidable. Will you stay silent, or will you step forward? Here's another hook. Courage is not proven when it is comfortable, it is proven when it costs something. Nathan risked everything: position, safety, even his life to speak. And that level of courage is rare, not because people don't recognize truth, but because they hesitate when truth requires action. But courage without wisdom can do damage. That's why Nathan's legacy is not just about boldness, it's about precision. He didn't rush. He didn't react. He understood the moment, the person, and the method. And because of that, his words didn't create resistance, they created recognition. That is what makes his legacy so powerful. It's not just speak truth. It's speak truth in a way that transforms. And in a world filled with noise, opinions, and constant reaction, that kind of clarity is rare. Most people choose one of two extremes. They either stay silent to avoid conflict, or they speak carelessly without considering impact. Nathan chose neither. He spoke at the right time, in the right way, for the right reason. And that combination is what turned a dangerous confrontation into a defining moment of transformation. Here's the final hook. The health of any system depends on whether truth is allowed to exist inside it. Because when truth is silenced, corruption grows quietly. But when truth is spoken and received, even the most broken situations can begin to change. David was not perfect after that moment. His life was not free from consequence. But he was no longer living in illusion, and that made all the difference. So the story ends, not with perfection, but with clarity. A king who was confronted. A prophet who spoke. A truth that could not be ignored. And a legacy that continues to ask the same question again and again, in every generation, in every position of influence, in every life that carries responsibility. When the moment comes, will you have the courage to hear the truth and the courage to speak it?